The Corrales Nexus knew the universe. It was not a boast, but a statement of fundamental truth, the bedrock upon which their millennia-old hegemony was built. From the shimmering, crystalline spires of Xylos to the swirling gas giants of the Cygnian Rim, every star, every species, every technological marvel was observed, cataloged, and ultimately understood. Their power was not derived from brute force, though their fleets were vast and formidable, but from the absolute certainty of comprehension. To the Nexus, knowledge was not merely power, it was the fabric of reality itself, and any thread that could not be woven into their grand tapestry was an anomaly to be unraveled and respun. Their fleets, vessels of living light and flawless geometry, moved through the void not as conquerors, but as auditors, bringing the grand, irrefutable logic of the Nexus to the chaotic corners of the cosmos. Every civilization they encountered was assessed by the Lumen, beings of pure energy and data who served as the Nexus's eyes and mind. The Lumen could read the history of a world in its radioactive decay and chart the future of a species in its genetic code. Nothing was hidden from them. No secret could be kept. And so, when they first encountered the solitary, clumsy vessels of humanity pushing their way out from an unremarkable yellow star, the Nexus viewed it as a routine cataloging, another fledgling race, noisy and ambitious, to be guided gently into the ordered fold of galactic society. Xylar, an archivist of the Lumen Collective aboard the analytical vessel Clarity, felt a familiar sense of dispassionate curiosity. He drifted as a being of coherent light within the data core of the ship, his consciousness intertwined with its vast sensor arrays. Before him, holographic representations of the target vessel shimmered a human colony ship designated the Traveler. It was an ugly thing, a brutalist construction of gray alloys and asymmetrical modules, scarred by micrometeoroid impacts and radiating a chaotic mess of energy signatures. Compared to the Clarity, a seamless teardrop of solidified light that sang with the harmony of perfectly aligned quantum processors, the human ship was an offense to logic and design. Its chemical rockets were a laughable throwback to a primitive era. Its data networks were a cacophony of unsecured transmissions, and its energy core leaked radiation like a sieve. Xylar and his fellow Lumen archivists processed the initial surface scans with a feeling that bordered on pity. These humans were children, fumbling in the dark with dangerous, inefficient toys. The directive from the Nexus was simple: perform a full core pattern scan, catalog their technology, biology, and societal structures, and prepare a preliminary integration strategy. It was a task the Clarity had performed on 100 nascent civilizations before. Initiating core pattern triangulation, a fellow Lumen's data signature chimed through the core, a note of pure, placid intellect. Surface composition confirms standard titanium alloys with primitive ceramic plating. No exotic matter detected. Energy core is a rudimentary fusion design, highly unstable. Xylar cross-referenced the findings with the Nexus archives, his own consciousness a flurry of perfectly executed queries. The results were as expected. Humanity was a Class 7 civilization, barely spacefaring. Their technology a predictable mishmash of stolen or poorly reverse-engineered principles. They were an open book, and a rather boring one at that. Proceed with the deep scan, Xylar transmitted, his own note resonating with the quiet authority of his station. Let us map their informational essence and be done with this. The Clarity adjusted its ethereal form, focusing a beam of pure analytical energy, a scalpel of light designed to peel back the layers of reality and read the source code of existence itself. The beam, undetectable and non-invasive, washed over the traveler, passed through its crude hull without resistance, and sought the heart of the vessel, its central computer, its crew, its very reason for being. Then the universe broke. It did not happen with an explosion or an alarm, but with a quiet, sickening lurch in the very foundation of logic. The first data stream returned from the deep scan was wrong. It wasn't encrypted. It wasn't shielded. It was simply impossible. The ship's fusion reactor was reported by the scanner as being simultaneously at full output and completely inert. One moment it was a star in a box. The next it was a lump of cold, dead metal. The life support systems registered as recycling atmosphere for 2,000 living souls, while also registering as a hard vacuum. Xylar felt a flicker of what a physical being might call nausea. He ran a diagnostic on the scanner. Perfect functionality. He ran it again. The results were the same. The impossible data flooded the Clarity's core, a torrent of paradoxes that its processors struggled to reconcile. The human crew was cataloged as being biologically present, their heartbeats and neural activity mapped with perfect clarity. Yet the pattern scan also returned a definitive result that the ship was empty, a ghost vessel populated only by echoes and memories. Error. Another lumen signature wavered, its perfect note now discordant and sharp. My logic centers cannot resolve the input. The ship's navigational computer is plotting a course to a star that does not exist. Yet it is also reporting its position as stationary. A wave of informational corruption spread through the Clarity. The flawless light of the data core began to stutter. The holographic displays flickered, showing schematics of the human ship that twisted and folded in on themselves like Escher paintings. A bulkhead on Deck 4 was suddenly reported as being both present and occupying the same space as the ship's main energy conduit. This was not a cyber attack. No foreign code had entered their systems. The Clarity was not being attacked. It was being contradicted. It was being poisoned by illogic. Then, the contagion leaped from the machine to its masters, to the Lumen, whose very existence was a symphony of pure data and flawless reason. A paradox was a fatal disease. Xylar watched in horror as the data signature of his colleague, the one who had first reported the error, simply unraveled. His light didn't extinguish, it was canceled out. His complex equation of a consciousness reduced to zero as his mind failed to compute the irreconcilable data. He was not dead. He was a solved problem, erased from reality as if he had never been. A silent, terrifying panic spread through the collective. Another lumen began to scream, not in sound, but in a raw, cascading waterfall of binary code that flooded the core's comms. The ones and zeros were a meaningless torrent of madness, but a translation matrix, working frantically, caught a single, recurring phrase amidst the chaos. The story is looking back at us. Xylar felt his own mind begin to fray at the edges. His own thoughts, usually as clear and precise as a star chart, were becoming clouded. He felt an intruding emotion, something alien and terrifyingly potent, a concept the Lumen had no word for. It was a mix of sorrow and defiance, of terror and a strange, unyielding thing called hope. In a desperate act of self-preservation, Xylar plunged his own consciousness directly into the raw data stream from the human ship, hoping to find the source of the corruption and sever it. He braced himself for a complex firewall, an alien AI, a blast of weaponized information. He found none of it. He found a lullaby. He found the ghost of a mother humming to a child in a cryopod, the memory of her song woven into the ship's radiation shielding. He found the lingering, stubborn belief of an engineer who had jury-rigged a failing power conduit with nothing more than a wrench and a prayer. His faith in his own work somehow solidifying the very atoms of the alloy. He saw flashes, not of data, but of feelings. He witnessed the terror of their departure from a dying world, a planet they called Earth, burning not from a sun's expansion, but from their own hands. He felt their collective, irrational determination to survive, to push a vessel never meant to cross the interstellar void into the unknown. This wasn't technology, it was a testament. The ship wasn't flying on principles of physics, but on the sheer, stubborn power of its crew's narrative. The reason the reactor was both active and inert was because it had failed a dozen times. But the chief engineer, a man long dead, had believed it would hold, and that belief was now a law of physics within the confines of the hull. The crew was both present and an echo because their legacy, their story, was as tangible a part of the ship as its bulkheads. The ship wasn't a machine. It was a ghost. It was a promise. It was a vessel haunted by the dreams of its creators, and its very existence was a paradox that logic could not withstand. And deep within that story, Xylar felt it the thing that was looking back. It was the Gestalt consciousness of humanity's desperate gamble, a psychic residue, a cognito hazard born of collective will. It was not malevolent. It did not attack. It simply was. And its nature was so fundamentally opposed to the Nexus's reality of cold, hard facts that to observe it was to have one's own logical existence nullified. With a final, agonizing effort, Xylar severed the connection. He tore his consciousness away from the human ship, an act that felt like ripping a part of his own soul out. The data core of the clarity fell silent, the torrent of impossible information ceasing. The ship was crippled. Of the 50 Lumen archivists who had begun the mission, only a handful remained, their light dim, their minds forever scarred by the touch of the impossible. They floated in the silent core, their perfect symphony shattered into a dirge of confusion and fear. The clarity, a vessel that had never known failure, limped away from the ugly, silent human ship. Its mission an unprecedented catastrophe. Back in the Nexus, Xylar delivered his report. He could not provide schematics, weapon analyses, or societal models. He could only offer a warning. He spoke of a new classification of threat, one the Nexus had no protocol for. He called it a cognito hazard, a danger not to the body or the ship, but to the mind, to the very concept of knowable reality. You cannot scan them, his report concluded, his data signature forever altered, now carrying a faint, permanent tremor of dissonance. Their technology is not forged from metal and science, but from belief and memory. Their ships are not machines. They are stories. And to read that story is to let it rewrite your own. To try and understand humanity is to be unwritten by them. The Corrales Nexus, for the first time in 10,000 years, was faced with a variable it could not compute. The Lumen, their most trusted analysts, were broken. The report was met with incredulity by the martial races, the strategists, the engineers. A story, a cognito hazard. It was preposterous, the ravings of a damaged mind. Clearly, the Lumen had encountered a novel form of psychic warfare and had been defeated. The solution, therefore, was not to retreat, but to escalate. Humanity was now reclassified from a subject of study to a priority threat. The order was given containment. Build a cordon around their pathetic little star system. Let no ship in or out. But a new, secret directive was also issued. shared only among the highest echelons of the Nexus Command. The analytical approach had failed. Therefore, a physical approach was required. They would not try to understand the next human ship they encountered. They would capture it. They would tear it apart, piece by piece, in a sterile laboratory far from the corrupting influence of its own impossible existence. They would dissect the paradox, believing they could master it, never once considering that you cannot put a ghost in a cage, and that the story of humanity was not confined to their ships, but was now, thanks to the clarity, a whisper in the heart of the Nexus itself. Xylar, confined to a meditative chamber for recalibration, could only watch the fleets gather, haunted by a truth they refused to see, that their quest for knowledge would be their doom, and that the greatest danger in the universe was not an enemy you could fight, but an idea you could not comprehend. Karg of the Vorkesh stood on the command deck of his battlecruiser, the ironclad Hand, and felt the familiar comforting thrum of the ship's singularity core through the soles of his armored boots. The Vorkesh were a people of substance. They believed in gravity, in the kinetic impact of a mass driver slug, in the searing heat of a plasma beam, and in the unyielding strength of a properly forged hull. They were the Nexus's mailed fist, the enforcers of its will, and they held a deep, abiding contempt for the ethereal intellectualism of the Lumen. To Karg, the Lumen were ghosts chasing shadows, beings so detached from the physical universe that they could be undone by a simple contradiction. His people had a saying, a paradox cannot stop a charging Groxnock, but a well-aimed spear can. He had reviewed the Clarity's report, a mess of nonsensical data streams, and panicked, illogical warnings about stories and beliefs. It was, in Karg's professional opinion, the most profound failure of nerve he had ever witnessed. Now, the Nexus had come to its senses. It had turned to the Vorkesh to solve this human problem with the only method that had ever truly worked: overwhelming, undeniable force. His orders were elegantly simple, a reflection of his own philosophy. Locate a human vessel, immobilize it with tractor fields and ion cannons, board it, secure it, and bring it to the Deep Space Analysis Station at Cygnus X1. There were to be no deep scans, no attempts at communication, no informational intrusion of any kind. They were not to read the book. They were to capture the pages, the ink, the binding, and let the Nexus's most hardened minds vivisect it in a sealed room. The Vorkesh fleet, a phalanx of brutal, gunmetal gray ships bristling with weapon emplacements, tore a hole in space-time and emerged at the edge of the quarantine Sol system. Their sensors, deliberately limited to basic passive detection, swept the void. It did not take long. A single contact appeared, drifting silently in the dark. It was a human warship. Its designation scraped from a salvaged data fragment, the TNS Valediction. It was smaller than expected, a wedge of scarred and pitted metal that looked ancient, a relic from a forgotten conflict. Patches of its hull were discolored, as if from weapons fire that had been endured centuries ago. No energy signature to speak of, no engine glow, no sign of life. It looked like a derelict, a tombstone floating in the void. Karg's lip curled in a predatory smile. This was the source of the Lumen's terror, this piece of space junk. All ships, advance to engagement range, he growled, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the command deck. Target its propulsion systems. I want it crippled, not destroyed. Fire on my mark. The Vorkesh fleet moved with the disciplined precision of a predator pack, closing in on wounded prey, targeting reticles locked on to the Valediction's stern. There was no electronic handshake, No complex data exchange that could be corrupted. Vorkesh gunners aimed by sight. They're targeting computers using simple light and gravitational displacement, the oldest and most reliable methods. Fire, Karg commanded. A storm of incandescent plasma and hypervelocity slugs erupted from the fleet, a wave of physical destruction that could crack a small moon. And then the second impossibility occurred. The first had been the lumen's failure. This one was a violation of physics. The human ship did not move. It did not raise shields. It did not return fire. It simply continued to drift. And the entire volley missed. It didn't swerve at the last second or dissipate against some unseen barrier. The projectiles, all of them, from every ship in the fleet, seemed to phase through the space the valediction occupied, continuing on into the empty void beyond as if their target was nothing more than a hologram. Karg stared, his knuckles white where he gripped the command rail. The gunnery chief's station flashed with error messages. "Report!" Karg roared. "Commander," the chief stammered, his thick claws tapping frantically at his console. All trajectories were perfect. All systems report a successful firing solution. But there was no impact. The target is still there, but our weapons registered a clean miss. It's as if it wasn't there when they arrived. This was not a story. This was a physical event. Karg felt a cold knot tighten in his gut, an unfamiliar sensation he quickly crushed with a surge of warrior's rage. "Again," he bellowed. "Full power saturation fire. Fill that section of space with so much energy it has no choice but to be there." The second volley was even more intense, a blinding torrent of destruction. And again, nothing. The derelict ship floated, untouched, its scarred hull a silent mockery of their power. This was not technology. No stealth field, no phase shifter known to the Nexus could do this. This was an insult to the very laws of cause and effect. "Enough," Karg snarled. "Bring us alongside. Launch boarding parties. If our weapons cannot touch it, our hands will." The ironclad hand moved closer, its massive form dwarfing the silent human vessel. Grappling claws of solid durasteel, each the size of a fighter craft, fired from its belly, designed to punch through any hull and anchor the ships together. This time, there was contact. The claws slammed into the valediction's hull with a deafening screech of tortured metal, biting deep. The derelict was real. It was solid. A tremor of victory ran through Karg. Whatever trick it had used, it was a trick of ranged combat. Up close, it was just another ship. He led the first boarding party himself, his combat armor sealed, a heavy pulse rifle in his hands. The boarding tube breached the hull, and Karg stepped into the cold, silent interior of a human warship. The air was stale, thin, but breathable. There was no power, no light save for the beams of their helmet lamps. The corridors were utilitarian, gray, and coated in a fine layer of dust. And they were empty. There were no bodies, no signs of a struggle. Just an unnerving, profound silence that seemed to soak up the sound of their armored boots. The ship felt wrong. The angles of the corridors seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. A doorway Karg had just passed through would sometimes seem, out of the corner of his eye, and to be a solid wall. The silence itself was a pressure, punctuated by faint, indecipherable whispers that seemed to come from the metal of the ship itself. His soldiers were unsettled, their disciplined advance slowing as they swept through empty crew quarters, a silent mess hall, a dark and powerless engine room. "Commander," his second-in-command transmitted, his voice tight. "The ship's layout, it does not match the exterior scans. This corridor should have terminated 30 meters ago. It keeps going. Karg felt it too. It was like walking through a dream. They were moving forward, but they were making no progress. Then the hauntings began. A flicker of movement at the edge of a lamp's beam, a fleeting shadow in the shape of a man, gone before anyone could get a clear look. A faint, mournful melody that echoed for a moment down a long hallway before vanishing. On a dusty table in the mess hall, one of his warriors found a cup of steaming, dark liquid. It was hot to the touch. It could not have been there for more than a minute. Panic, the sworn enemy of the Vorkesh, began to coil in the air. Karg fought it down, his iron will the only thing keeping his squad together. "Press on," he commanded, his voice a low growl. "The bridge. We take the bridge. We take the ship." They found the bridge door, a heavy slab of metal that was surprisingly unlocked. Karg kicked it open and stepped inside, his rifle ready. The bridge was as empty and dark as the rest of the ship, covered in the same blanket of ancient dust. View screens were cracked. Consoles were cold and dead. In the center of the room sat a captain's chair, empty. But as Karg's light swept across it, something flickered on a small, secondary screen near the armrest. It was a single and repeating line of text in a blocky human script. One of the team's linguists translated it, his voice trembling. It says, "We gave our ghosts so they would have nothing left to take." As the words were spoken, a cold wave washed over them, a feeling of profound, soul-crushing loss. It wasn't Karg's loss. It was someone else's. An ancient grief that had soaked into the very fabric of the ship. He saw a flash in his mind's eye, not a memory, but an impression. He saw this bridge, alive with light and energy. He saw a crew, their faces grim and determined. He saw the view screen showing not the empty void, but a swirling vortex of impossible colors, a tear in reality. And pouring from that tear were things, beings of shadow and madness, things that should not exist. He felt the human captain's resolve, the terrible decision he had made. He felt the surge of power as the ship's reactor was deliberately overloaded, not to destroy the ship, but to power something else, something built into its core. The valediction wasn't a warship. It was a containment vessel. It was a cage. And its crew had sacrificed not just their lives, but their very essences, their memories, their souls, their stories to power it, to turn their collective will into a law of physics that held the cage shut. That was why their weapons had passed through. The ship existed in a state of perpetual sacrifice, its reality maintained by the ghosts of its crew. It could not be harmed by conventional means because its existence wasn't entirely conventional. To attack it was to attack a memory. Suddenly, Karg understood. The whispers, the shifting corridors, the hot cup of coffee. They were echoes of the crew, the lingering fragments of the story that held the real enemy at bay. And his boarding party had just walked into the heart of the prison. The bridge door slammed shut behind them, sealing them in darkness. The whispers grew louder, no longer just in the air, but inside their heads. The Vorkesh warriors cried out, clutching their helmets. They weren't being attacked by a psychic force. They were being filled with the memories of the dead crew, the horror of their final battle, the unending agony of their eternal vigil. Karg fell to his knees, his rifle clattering to the floor. He saw the face of the human captain, not as an alien, but as a fellow commander, a warrior who had made the ultimate sacrifice. He felt the captain's final thought, a message left for any who might follow. What we fought is still out there. This too must not be disturbed. Karg, the pragmatic warrior who believed only in steel and strength, was broken by a ghost story. With the last of his strength, he activated his comm. "Retreat," he gasped, his voice raspy. "All forces, retreat. Get out of this ship, get out now." The grappling claws disengaged, and the Vorkesh ships pulled back frantically. But it was too late. The ironclad hand was no longer just a Vorkesh vessel, as it limped away from the silent, drifting tomb. Its crew was changed. They were haunted. Soldiers would wake up screaming from nightmares of a war they had never fought. Technicians would see flickering, human-shaped shadows on their sensor screens. And Karg, in the dead of night on his own command bridge, would sometimes hear a faint, mournful melody and feel a grief that was not his own. The Nexus's second attempt had failed. They had not captured a human ship. They had breached a tomb. And a ghost, a story of a war fought in the dark, was now loose within their own fleet, carried in the minds of their most steadfast warriors. The quarantine had not been broken. It had been inverted. Something had gotten out. The haunting of the Vorkesh fleet was a cancer in the heart of the Nexus's military. Karg's official report was a chilling masterpiece of warriors' prose, stripped of the Lumen's esoteric nonsense and replaced with stark, terrifying facts. He spoke of corridors that defied Euclidean geometry, of physics-violating phenomena, and of a psychic wound inflicted upon his men that no medic or psychotechnician could heal. The once unflinching Vorkesh shock troops now suffered from collective hallucinations. They saw ghostly figures in human pressure suits walking through the solid bulkheads of their ships and heard whispered laments on secured comm channels. Discipline was fraying, replaced by a pervasive, superstitious dread. The Nexus leadership, a council of beings representing the galaxy's most powerful races, was now facing a crisis that threatened to unravel their millennium of dominance. The intellectual approach had led to madness. The physical approach had led to infection. They had one final tool and last specialized instrument designed to solve the unsolvable. They turned to the architects of Syl, the geometers. The geometers were not biological, nor were they beings of pure energy. They were sentient, crystalline life forms, their consciousness distributed across the flawless, latticed structure of their bodies. They perceived the universe not as a collection of objects and forces, but as a single but infinitely complex geometric equation. To them, stars were points of stress in the fabric of space-time. Life was a self-replicating fractal pattern. Technology was the art of imposing a new, more elegant geometry upon the old. Their ships were not built, but grown, coaxed into existence by manipulating quantum probabilities until space itself folded into the desired shape. They were the ultimate artisans of reality, and they viewed the human cognito hazard not as a psychic threat or a ghost story, but as a structural flaw in the universe's equation, a mathematical error that needed to be isolated, understood, and erased. The prime geometer, a being designated as Axion, received the directive aboard the analysis vessel Pattern Weaver. Axion's form was a slowly rotating crystal of breathtaking complexity, its internal facets glowing with the cool, blue light of pure calculation. It felt no fear or contempt, only a profound sense of aesthetic offense. The data from the Lumen and the Vorkesh described a phenomenon that was asymmetrical, messy. It lacked the clean, predictable elegance of a properly functioning reality. The Pattern Weaver was a thing of impossible beauty and terror. It was a perfect sphere of obsidian-smooth material that did not reflect light, but seemed to absorb it. And orbiting this central sphere were 3 rings of shimmering, crystalline structures that rotated at different speeds and on different planes. The geometer's plan was meticulous and, they believed, foolproof. They would not touch the target. They would not scan it in any conventional sense. They would deconstruct it from a distance, peeling it apart one quantum layer at a time. The pattern weaver would project a causal disjunction field, a bubble of space-time where the fundamental connections between cause and effect could be gently loosened. Inside this field, the ship's atomic bonds would be unraveled, its energy states cataloged, and its entire physical and informational structure mapped without a single foreign particle ever crossing the event horizon. It was the ultimate autopsy, performed on a cosmic scale. Their target was another silent, drifting human vessel, the TNS Odyssey, a long-haul colony ship that had gone dark centuries ago near the Perseus Veil. It was larger than the Valediction, its design suggesting a purpose more of endurance than of combat. It floated in the void like a forgotten promise. Axion and the other geometers aboard the Pattern Weaver began the process. The orbiting rings of the ship spun faster, emitting a low, harmonic chime that was not sound, but a vibration in the structure of space itself. The disjunction field expanded, a perfectly transparent sphere that enveloped the Odyssey. From the command center of the Pattern Weaver, a chamber of pure, resonant crystal, the geometers observed the target on displays that showed not light or heat, but the very mathematics of its existence. Deconstruction initiated. Axion communicated through a pulse of patterned light. Outer hull layer, atomic lattice integrity is anomalous. The metallic bonds are reinforced by a non-physical quantum entanglement, a field of sheer emotional residue. The geometers observed this calmly. It was unexpected, but it was still just data. A machine on the ship began to translate the residue into comprehensible terms. Words flickered on a screen: determination, fear of the dark, stubbornness. The field continued its work. The outer hull dissolved, its atoms neatly sorted and cataloged. Then the next layer, and the next. They moved past empty corridors and crew quarters, the deconstruction field revealing the lingering geometric impressions of lives lived and lost. They found the ghost of a child's laughter imprinted on the walls of a nursery, a pattern of joy that was mathematically chaotic but structurally stable. They found the echoes of 1,000 arguments, 1,000 songs, 1,000 quiet moments of despair, all woven into the ship's superstructure, acting as a kind of spiritual reinforcement. The geometers were fascinated. It was an ugly, inefficient method of construction, but the principles were novel. They were learning, mapping the strange physics of the human soul as if it were just another exotic material. They felt no empathy, no horror. They were simply surgeons, dissecting a strange new anatomy. Proceeding to central core. Axion pulsed. Life support and cryostasis section. And this was the heart of the ship, the reason for its long journey, and the field focused, its touch becoming more delicate as it began to peel away the layers of the heavily shielded cryobay. It was here that the nature of the operation changed. As the field touched the cryopods, it did not find the simple day or lingering memories of the crew. It found something stored, potent, concentrated. It found the sum total of every dream the frozen colonists had ever had. As the first cryopod was deconstructed, a wave of pure, unfiltered emotion was released from its geometric prison. It was not a memory of hope. It was hope itself. It was a raw, conceptual force, a blast of irrational, asymmetrical, chaotic energy that slammed into the pristine, logical minds of the geometers. To a crystalline being whose consciousness was a perfect, repeating pattern, the raw, unstructured chaos of a human dream was like a sonic blast shattering a pane of glass. Axion felt its own internal lattice shudder violently. A hairline fracture, a flaw, appeared deep within its crystalline mind. The cool blue light of its thoughts was suddenly contaminated by a surge of brilliant, illogical gold. It felt the human colonist dream of a sun on his face, of soil between his fingers, of a child he had yet to meet. The concepts were meaningless, but the feeling behind them was a corrosive agent, dissolving the rigid connections of its thought processes. The deconstruction field faltered. Across the command chamber, the other geometers flickered, their perfect forms warping. The air, once silent, was now filled with the faint, dissonant chime of fracturing crystal. They were not screaming. Their very existence was cracking apart. "Cease the deconstruction." Axion pulsed, a tremor of something akin to panic in its signal. But it was too late. The field had breached dozens of pods, and a torrent of dreams was now flooding the space around the dying Odyssey. The dreams of artists, scientists, farmers, and lovers all burst forth a wave of love, grief, ambition, and insane, unquenchable optimism. And then, all those dreams, all that released emotional energy, began to coalesce. It was not an explosion. It was an act of creation. The ghost of the Odyssey was not a guardian like the valediction. It was a seed, a chrysalis, and the geometers had just broken it open. Before them, where the human ship had been, a new being was taking shape, woven from the light of a billion forgotten dreams. It was a creature of impossible form, part nebula, part living light, with wings of memory and a heart that pulsed with the pure, chaotic energy of hope. It was the Gestalt soul of the Odyssey's mission, the story made manifest. The new entity did not attack. It reached out. A tendril of its dream stuff touched the hull of the pattern weaver, but instead of destroying it, it began to change it. The ship's perfect, spherical form began to warp. Crystalline structures grew from its surface, not in perfect, geometric angles, but in the wild, beautiful, asymmetrical patterns of a blooming flower or a branching tree. The obsidian hull began to glow with shifting, soft colors. Inside, Axion felt the entity's consciousness touch its own. It was not an attack. It was an offering. It was showing Axion the beauty of a flawed circle, the elegance of a chaotic spiral, the profound meaning in an incomplete equation. It was teaching it how to dream. The prime geometer Axion's last transmission to the Nexus was not a report. It was a single, incomprehensible image, the mathematical formula for a human smile, followed by an endless, repeating stream of what could only be described as a symphony. Then, silence. The Nexus had lost its artisans. They had sent their mind, their fist, and their hands, and each had been defeated not by a weapon, but by an aspect of their enemy's spirit. The lumen had been broken by humanity's story, the Vorkesh haunted by their sacrifice, and now the geometers had been transformed by their dreams. The Nexus leadership finally understood. They were not fighting a species. They were fighting a fundamental concept, an idea that had been given form and fury in the crucible of some ancient, forgotten war. Their attempts to contain or understand it had only served to break the seals on the tombs and arcs humanity had left behind. They were no longer the auditors of the galaxy. They were now just another name on a long list of people who had made the grave mistake of disturbing the dead. And they knew, with a certainty that chilled the very marrow of their diverse biologies, that the stories were not over, and the worst was yet to come. Panic was an inefficient, asymmetrical emotion, and for that reason, the Corrales Nexus had spent 10,000 years systematically engineering it out of their collective consciousness. Now, it had returned. It returned in the fractured reports from the Vorkesh, whose greatest warriors were now confined to psychological wards, babbling about a captain's guilt and a war fought against shadows. It returned in the strange, beautiful, and utterly useless transmissions from the former geometer space, where perfect spheres were now growing chaotic, crystalline gardens and broadcasting mathematical proofs of love. The Nexus, the great anchor of logic in a chaotic universe, was unraveling at the seams, infected not by a plague of the body, but of the soul. In an emergency session convened within the zero-point chamber at the heart of their hegemony, the assembled leaders of the great races finally admitted the truth. They had exhausted their specialized tools. They could not outthink, outfight, or outmaneuver an enemy whose very existence was a weapon against reason itself. There was only one option left, the one reserved for threats that defied all other solutions, the one spoken of only in whispers, the finality. The finality were not a race or a faction, they were a function, an order of beings who served as the custodians of the Nexus's most terrible weapon. They were the universal constant of entropy given form and purpose. They did not conquer or analyze, they deleted. Their leader, the matriarch of the void, was a being who had long since shed her physical form, existing now as a cold, still presence within the heart of her vessel, the absence. She listened to the council's panicked debate with a profound sense of weary inevitability. She had seen this before chaos, illogic, and the desperate turn to her for a clean, quiet end. The human contagion is a flaw in the grand equation, the matriarch transmitted, her thoughts cutting through the chamber like shards of ice. It spreads through contact, through observation. You cannot cure a corrupted data stream. You must erase the file. You cannot heal a diseased limb. You must cauterize it from the body of the universe. My purpose is not to understand the flaw. It is to unmake it. The council was silent. To deploy the absence was an admission of ultimate failure, an act so profound it would be recorded not as a victory, but as a scar upon reality. But the fear of humanity was now greater than the fear of the void. They gave their assent. The absence was not a ship. It was a mobile, localized hole in the universe. It was a perfect darkness, a sphere of non-existence that did not travel through space so much as it unhappened from one location and rehappened in another. On its surface, if such a word could be used, nothing could be seen, for it did not reflect or absorb light. It negated the very concept of photons. Inside, the matriarch and the other members of the finality existed in a state of pure, passionless potential, their only function to aim their weapon, the Eater of Light. The Eater did not fire a beam or launch a projectile. When activated, and it would designate a section of space-time and simply revoke its right to exist. It didn't just destroy matter and energy, it erased causality. Anything caught in its field would not be turned to dust, but would cease to have ever been. History itself would rewrite around the new, clean void. It was the ultimate weapon against an enemy of memory and story, for it was a weapon that could erase the story from time itself. The matriarch's target was not a single vessel. Her logic was cold and absolute. The previous failures had stemmed from interacting with individual instances of the anomaly. The solution was to target the source, the nexus of the infection, not the human homeworld, which was still behind its baffling quarantine, but a place cataloged by long-range sensors centuries ago and marked with the highest possible threat rating, a sector of space known only as the Elysian Graveyard. It was a place where hundreds of human warships, relics of their forgotten war, drifted together in a silent, ordered formation, a memorial of cold, dead metal. The matriarch hypothesized this was the origin point of the cognitohazard, a graveyard that was, in fact, an archive, a library of the very stories that were poisoning the galaxy. To erase it would be to rip the root of the weed from the soil of reality. The absence unhappened from Nexus space and rehappened at the edge of the Elysian graveyard. The sight was breathtaking and deeply unsettling. An armada of silent ships, their hulls scarred with the evidence of an unimaginable conflict, hung in the void. She recognized the design of the valediction, the tomb. She saw the lines of the Odyssey, the seed, and there were hundreds more, each one a different class, a different design, each one radiating a unique and potent silence. Target the central mass, the matriarch commanded, her will focusing the immeasurable power of her vessel. Prepare the Eater of Light. We will erase this monument to madness and all the ghosts it contains. The absence began to glow, not with light, but with a deeper, more profound darkness. The space before it began to shimmer and warp as the laws of physics were put under unbearable strain. A field of absolute nullity began to form, a bubble of non-existence that would expand and consume the entire graveyard. This weapon was different. It did not touch. It did not analyze. It did not deconstruct. There was no medium through which the human contagion could pass. It was a clean, surgical, conceptual strike. As the null field began to coalesce, the graveyard responded. Not with engines, not with shields, not with weapons. An energy signature of a type the Nexus had never conceived of began to flow between the derelict ships, and the silent tombs did not awaken to fight. They awakened to bear witness. From the ships like the valediction, a wave of pure conceptual sacrifice washed over the void, the cold, heavy certainty of an ending, the grief of a battle already lost for a cause already won. From the ships like the Odyssey, a counterwave of pure, conceptual hope surged forth, the irrational, explosive joy of a beginning, the dream of a future that refused to be denied. And from a third class of ship, brutal-looking assault vessels whose names were still scorched onto their hulls, Retribution, Indomitable, Fury, came a third, terrible wave. It was not a memory or a dream. It was pure, distilled, weaponized rage. It was the undying fury of every soldier who had fallen in that forgotten war, an eternal moment of combat, a scream of defiance that had never ended. The Eater of Light was designed to erase a single and coherent timeline, but now it was faced with three contradictory, conceptual truths, all bombarding it at once. It was being commanded to erase a target that was simultaneously a tomb, a cradle, and a battlefield. It was trying to delete a story that was an ending, a beginning, and a perpetually violent present, all occupying the same coordinates. The matriarch felt a shudder in the absolute stillness of her being. The null field wavered, its perfect darkness flickering. An error message appeared in her mind, a concept so alien to her order it was nearly incomprehensible. Target indeterminate. The weapon could not resolve the paradox. To erase something, you must first define what it is. And the combined will of the human fleet refused to be defined. The Eater of Light, the ultimate expression of certainty and finality, stalled, and the backlash was instantaneous. The three conceptual waves, having no target to break against, washed over the absence. The weapon did not explode. It became a conduit. And into the cold, silent, empty minds of the matriarch and the finality poured the very thing they had sought to erase, the whole, terrible, agonizing story. She was no longer in her vessel. She was on the bridge of the valediction as its captain chose to sacrifice his crew's souls to cage a horror. She was in the cryo bays of the Odyssey as the last colonists of a dying Earth dreamed of a new home, weaving their hope into the ship's very structure. She was on the front lines, inside the Fury, feeling the rage and terror of a young pilot as she faced an enemy that was not a ship or a creature, but a sentient plague that consumed minds and rewrote physics. She saw what they had fought. It was a being from the outer dark, a consciousness that existed between realities, which the humans had called the static. It did not conquer, it converted, turning stars, planets, and living beings into extensions of its own meaningless, chaotic self. And she saw humanity's desperate, horrifying solution. They had not defeated the static. They had realized it could not be defeated by conventional means. So, they had forged their own souls into conceptual weapons. They had turned their warships into tombs, seeds, and monuments of fury. They had sacrificed their own reality to build a cage around their enemy, a cage made of memory, hope, and rage. The Elysian graveyard was not a memorial. It was the lock. The ships were not weapons aimed at the galaxy. They were the bars of a prison, and their eternal vigil was the only thing keeping a universe-ending horror at bay. The matriarch's consciousness snapped back to the absence, but she was no longer empty. She was full of the stories, the grief, the hope, the rage. She, the being of finality, had been given a history. The weapon was silent, its crew catatonic, forever lost in the echoes of a war they had never known. Her last act, before her own mind was subsumed by the weight of 1 billion borrowed memories, was to realize the full, catastrophic depth of their mistake. Their attempts to understand, capture, deconstruct, and now erase humanity's guardians had done more than just fail. They had hammered against the lock. They had tested the bars. And in the absolute darkness, far beyond the borders of known space, something that had been imprisoned for eons in a cage made of ghosts and dreams finally noticed that its jailers were being systematically dismantled by a group of arrogant, foolish children. The silence was over. The static was listening. The silence of the finality was more terrifying than any scream. When the absence returned to the Nexus's core space, it did not report. It did not communicate. It simply hung there, a perfect sphere of darkness that now felt less like a weapon and more like a wound. Probes sent to investigate it returned with their data cores wiped, their sensors showing nothing but a flat line. But the most chilling discovery was made by a Lumen telepath, one of the few who had retained his sanity. He cautiously extended his senses toward the vessel and recoiled not in pain, but in awe and horror. The ship was no longer empty. It was an echo chamber, filled to overflowing with the cacophony of 1 billion souls, 1 billion deaths, 1 billion last stands. The matriarch of the void was still there, her consciousness intact but no longer her own. She was now a living library of humanity's forgotten war, a silent, eternal witness to a sacrifice the galaxy had never known. The Nexus had thrown its ultimate weapon at the heart of the human mystery, and that heart had captured it whole. This was the final, irrefutable proof their gods were dead. Their logic was a lie, and the universe was infinitely more vast and terrible than their catalogs had ever allowed. Panic, once a foreign concept, became the new galactic standard. The Vorkesh fleet was in shambles, its warriors locked in a perpetual, unwinnable war against the ghosts in their own minds. The geometers had gone silent. their corner of the galaxy now a burgeoning forest of chaotic crystal, broadcasting symphonies that caused logical systems to crash. And now, the finality. The very concept of erasure had been filled with an ineradicable memory. The contagion was everywhere, but amidst the collapse, Xylar, the Lumen archivist who had first touched the impossible truth of the colony ship Traveler, found a strange clarity. The dissonance that had once been a wound in his mind was now a key. While his peers saw only chaos, he began to perceive a pattern, a language in the madness. He could feel the thrum of the human story not as a threat, but as a warning. He understood that the tombs and the seeds and the monuments of fury were not just prisons. They were buoys, marking the edge of an abyss. And with the failure of the absence, he felt a new, far colder dread ripple through the cosmos. The hammering on the cage had stopped, and something in the deep dark was now testing the bars. He saw it first in the deep space observatories, a star, a healthy main sequence star in the Perseus arm. Didn't go nova or collapse. It just faded. Over the course of a single cycle, it turned a dull, lifeless gray. And then it was gone, leaving behind no nebula, no black hole, just a patch of sky that was unnervingly blank. Then another, and another. It was a plague of absence, a creeping silence spreading from the outer dark. It was the static, the enemy humanity had faced. And it was no longer waiting. Stripped of their arrogance and their power, the leaders of the Corrales Nexus convened for the last time. Xylar, a being now seen as either a prophet or the first victim of the plague, stood before them. We tried to read their story and were unwritten, he projected, his light flickering with the strange, new emotional colors he had absorbed. We tried to cage their ghosts and became haunted. We tried to deconstruct their dream and were remade by it. We tried to erase their memory and it became our own. Every tool we possess is based on the principle that the universe is a thing to be known. We were wrong. The universe is a story to be told, and we have forgotten how to speak. There's only one source of knowledge left that matters. His proposal was anathema, a heresy of the highest order. He proposed a diplomatic mission. He proposed they go to the source of the infection, to the quarantined cradle of humanity, and do the one thing they had never done in their entire history: ask for help. It was an act of ultimate desperation. They had no other choice. A single, unarmed vessel, a shuttle carrying Xylar and representatives from the broken Vorkesh and the silent geometers, was dispatched toward the Sol system. As they approached the quarantine line, a barrier of warped space-time that had held for centuries, it simply dissolved before them. There was no challenge, no automated warning. They were expected. They were led not to a grand orbital station or a planet bristling with defenses, but to a quiet moon orbiting the system's fourth planet. There, in a simple, unadorned chamber, they met him. He was not a king or an admiral in a starched uniform. He was an old man in a simple gray tunic, his face a roadmap of ancient weariness, his eyes holding the light of 1 billion dying stars. He was the caretaker, the living archive of the war. "You are afraid," the old man said, his voice a quiet rustle, yet it filled the room. He did not speak through a translator. The Nexus delegates simply understood him, his words resonating with the human echoes already inside them. You broke the seals, you woke the sleepers, and now you feel the silence spreading. You call it the static. We called it the great unraveling. It is not an enemy. It is a state of being. The universe's natural tendency toward perfect, ordered, meaningless silence. It consumes stories. It feeds on certainty. The more you knew, the more you defined. the more you fed it. Xylar pulsed in understanding. The Nexus's obsession with cataloging everything had been ringing the dinner bell for the static for millennia. Your ships, the Vorkesh commander rumbled, his voice strained. Your ghosts. The old man nodded slowly. We couldn't defeat the silence with logic or force. It consumed them. So we fought it with noise. We took our most powerful, chaotic, illogical emotions, our grief, our dreams, our rage, and we forged them into anchors. We turned our ships into paradoxes, vessels that exist as both a memory and a reality, a presence that the static's logic cannot resolve. Our ghosts are the sentinels. They are the story that holds the silence at bay. But they were only meant to be a lock, and you have broken it. A star chart shimmered into existence in the center of the room. The creeping gray voids were spreading. Faster now. The lock is failing, the caretaker said, his voice heavy with a grief that dwarfed anything the Vorkesh had felt. We are too few to hold it back alone. The war we fought, it hollowed us out. We burned our own souls to fuel the forge that made our guardians. He looked at each of them, his gaze piercing. The static will consume you. Your logic, your order, your vast knowledge, it will all become gray, silent, and still. There is one other option. You can help us tell a new story. He extended a hand, its skin thin as paper. We can give you the ghosts. We can teach you how to dream. We can show you the righteous, burning fury of a cause worth dying for. But you must accept the price. You will cease to be the Corrales Nexus. You will no longer be beings of pure logic or perfect geometry or unyielding strength. You will become flawed. You will feel pain. You will know fear and doubt. You will become haunted, and you will become dreamers. You will learn to fight the silence not with certainty, but with a story so loud and beautiful and angry that it deafens the void. It was the ultimate choice, a quiet, orderly oblivion, or a messy, painful, glorious survival. For the first time, the assembled races of the Nexus acted not from logic, but from a nascent, terrifying instinct. Xylar, his light already a maelstrom of color, reached out and accepted the human's offer, and, across the galaxy, a wave of change washed through the crippled Nexus. On the bridge of the ironclad hand, a Vorkesh warrior looked up and saw the ghostly form of a human captain standing beside him, not as a specter of fear, but as a comrade, raising a spectral hand and pointing toward the encroaching dark. In the crystalline forests of Syl, the geometers began to weave the chaotic beauty of human dreams into their very structures, growing ships that sang with impossible symphonies, their songs pushing back against the spreading silence. And Xylar, aboard his own vessel, felt the last vestiges of his old self fall away. He was no longer just a lumen. He was a keeper of stories, a dreamer of futures, a vessel for a righteous rage. He looked out at the star chart, at the encroaching void of the static. The war was not over. The war had just begun. But now, for the first time, the galaxy was not silent. It was a chorus of ghosts and dreams, of Vorkesh fury and geometer beauty, all united by the terrible, beautiful, chaotic story of humanity. They were no longer the auditors of the universe. They were its guardians. And they had a story to tell, a final, defiant shout into the encroaching night.